Hey beautiful, have you considered subscribing to our channel? It helps us make quality content for you. Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers.
The wind whispered through the tall grasses of the farm, the sun painting golden streaks across the vast expanse of 800 acres that had been in Jake's family for generations. The faint scent of earth and hay hung in the air as he leaned back, in his chair, his boots resting comfortably on the porch railing. The sound of cicadas hummed in the background, harmonizing with the rhythmic tapping of his wife, Sarah, as she prepared a quick dinner. Their two kids, Emily and Ben, played nearby, the laughter of their youth carrying through the air. Everything was perfect. After years of long hours and hard work, they were finally taking a break. This vacation to the Grand Canyon was more than just a getaway. It was a moment to breathe, to reset. Jake couldn't remember the last time he had taken time off, and it felt like a weight was lifting from his shoulders. The farm would be fine. Everything was in place. It had always been in place. Everything's locked up tight, he told Sarah, giving her a reassuring smile. Not a thing to worry about. She smiled back, but there was a trace of concern in her eyes. I just hope we don't get any surprises while we're gone. Jake chuckled, wiping his brow. We've worked too hard for that, the farm's secure. Now let's just enjoy the week. The next few days passed in a blur of breathtaking sights and laughter. Jake had forgotten how much he loved nature, how much he missed these moments of pure joy with his family. But all of that came crashing down the moment they returned home. They had just crossed the town line when Jake noticed the first sign. A large, imposing banner was draped across the entrance to their farm, blocking the once familiar dirt road. It read, "Private property, no trespassing." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He slowed the truck, frowning. There was no way it was a mistake. He knew that stretch of road like the back of his hand. Did we forget to put up a sign or something? Sarah asked, her voice tight with uncertainty. Jake shook his head, his eyes narrowing. No way. This doesn't make sense. He drove closer, and as the truck bounced along the gravel, a second sight sent a chill crawling down his spine. A group of unfamiliar men were walking the property line, marking out areas with spray paint. They didn't even glance at Jake's truck as it rolled up. Who the hell are they? Jake muttered under his breath, pulling up to a stop. He climbed out of the truck, Sarah following close behind. The scent of fresh paint and dust filled the air, mixing with the faint tang of motor oil. One of the men, a burly figure in a neon vest, looked up at them, his face blank. "Can I help you?" Jake asked, his voice low but tinged with growing frustration. The man didn't respond right away. He glanced over to his companions, who continued to mark the land, seemingly unaware of the conversation. Finally, the man spoke. "You need to leave," he said flatly. "This property is under new management." Jake's stomach dropped. "New management? What the hell are you talking about? This is my land." The man shrugged, unbothered. "The HOA's property now. Got your papers in order?" Jake's mind raced, the words echoing in his head. HOA. He felt his pulse quicken. The homeowners association had been a thorn in his side for years, but never like this. They'd tried to push zoning changes, demanded certain updates to the property that Jake had refused to comply with, but never had they gone this far. "My papers are fine," Jake said, trying to steady his breath. "You've made a mistake. This is my family's land." The man didn't flinch. "You've got about 5 minutes to leave before we call the authorities." The words stung. Jake stood there for a moment, unable to process what he was hearing. His hands clenched into fists, the weight of the situation settling over him like a suffocating blanket. "I'm not going anywhere," he finally said, voice tight with anger. "You're on my land, and I'm not leaving until I know what's going on." He turned to Sarah, who was standing a few steps behind him, her face pale. Emily and Ben were at the edge of the truck, staring at the scene unfolding before them. "Stay here," Jake said softly, before walking towards the men marking the property. As he got closer, one of the men lifted his head, giving Jake a slow once-over. "You should have stayed out of it. The HOA's already bought this land. Your time's up." Jake froze. "What? Bought? This isn't just some zoning dispute. What the hell do you mean, bought?" The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder of documents, handing them over with a grunt. Jake took them with shaking hands, his heart pounding in his chest. The papers were official, so official it made him dizzy. It was a deed, stamped and signed, transferring ownership of the property to the local HOA. The words jumped off the page, searing into his brain. My family's farm. You can't just take it. This land's been in my family for over 100 years. The man didn't react, but a voice called out from behind him. Is there a problem here? Jake turned, seeing a woman stride toward him with a confident, almost smug demeanor. She was tall, her dark hair perfectly coiffed, a gleaming smile playing on her lips. She wore an expensive suit and exuded an air of entitlement that made Jake's blood run cold. I'm Cheryl Whitmore, she said, offering a firm handshake. President of the Maple Ridge HOA, and this is our property now. I suggest you get your things in order and leave. The words hit Jake like a slap. He looked down at the documents, his mind racing, but it was already clear. There was no mistake. They had taken it. They had taken everything. What do you mean, taken? He demanded, his voice rising. You can't just steal someone's land like this. Cheryl's smile didn't falter. We've legally acquired it. All the proper paperwork was filed. The county gave us the green light. You didn't file your updates, so here we are. Jake felt the ground shift beneath him. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He was stunned, unable to comprehend what was happening. The wind blew colder now, the laughter of his children still echoing in his ears. The perfect vacation was over, replaced with a nightmare he never saw coming. Cheryl Whitmore's smile never wavered as she stood before Jake, her presence filled with a cold sense of authority that made his stomach churn. He could see it in her eyes, the unspoken belief that she had won, that she could do whatever she wanted, and no one would dare stop her. Her heels clicked sharply on the gravel as she moved toward the paperwork. Still in Jake's trembling hands, she glanced at the documents with a cursory glance, and then back at him. Her voice smooth as silk. I've already spoken to the county. It's all legal. You failed to file the proper updates on your land, and as a result, it's now under the jurisdiction of the HOA. Jake's heart raced. The words burned through him. But they made no sense. The farm was his family's history. Their blood and sweat had shaped that land for generations. No government body could just snatch it away because of a clerical error. He stared at the papers, his fingers gripping the edges as if they might slip through, his hands like the dream he had held for so long. You're lying. He said the words rough and bitter as they left his lips. You can't just take it. You're not even from here. Cheryl's eyes narrowed and she tilted her head as if amused. I'm from a neighboring town, but I've made this community my home. That means I have a say in what happens here. And frankly, the farm you've been neglecting was an eyesore that needed to be cleaned up. Her voice had that practiced calmness to it, like she was explaining something to a child, and Jake could feel the rage building inside him, threatening to explode. I've worked this land my whole life. Jake's voice cracked, but he pushed forward. My family built this farm from nothing, and I'll be damned if I let you take it because of some bureaucratic nonsense. He could feel Sarah's worried gaze on him, but he couldn't look at her. He had to stay focused. He had to get answers. Cheryl didn't flinch. She didn't even look uncomfortable. She simply lifted her chin slightly as if the fight was beneath her. You've got about 5 minutes to get off the property before we call the authorities. I'm giving you a fair warning. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jake shook his head as his thoughts spiraled, his mind scrambling to figure out what had happened, what they had done to get away with this. Who had they bribed? Who had they manipulated? He didn't know, but he had to act now, or lose everything without thinking. He turned and stalked back to the truck, his fists clenched so tight his nails dug into his palms. The anger boiled inside him. It was so deep, so all-consuming, that for a moment he felt like he might explode. He had always prided himself on being a good man, someone who followed the rules, but now the rules didn't matter. They had taken something that wasn't theirs, something that didn't belong to them. Sarah reached out to stop him, her voice trembling. Jake, please don't do anything rash. We need to think this through. Her words barely registered. He could see the fear in her eyes, but he couldn't stop now. Not when they had taken everything from him. He got into the truck and slammed the darter behind him. Sarah climbed in beside him, her hands shaking as she buckled up. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. Jake stared straight ahead, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "I don't know yet," he said through gritted teeth. "But they've made a huge mistake. They think they've won, but they don't know me. They don't know what I'm capable of." He started the engine and drove down the road, the tires kicking up dirt behind them. His thoughts raced 1,000 miles a minute. But there was one thing he knew for sure. Cheryl Whitmore and the HOA had made the biggest mistake of their lives. Back at the farmhouse, Jake sat at the kitchen table staring at the papers scattered in front of him. The harsh words from Cheryl echoed in his mind, and the weight of the situation pressed down on him like a vice. Sarah paced the room, wringing her hands. She had always been the calm one, but even she couldn't keep it together now. "We can't just sit here and do nothing." Jake muttered more to himself than to her, but she stopped pacing and looked at him with those eyes he knew so well, those eyes that could see right through him. "We have to fight back," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "But how do we even begin to fight something like this?" She didn't wait for him to answer. She knew he didn't have an answer either. Jake stared down at the papers, his mind working through the problem one step at a time, his eyes flicking back and forth between the official-looking documents and the maps of the land. It was clear to him now that this wasn't some small-time bureaucratic mistake. This was a deliberate move. It had to be. "Maybe they didn't expect me to fight back," Jake said slowly, a thought starting to form in his mind. A plan began to take shape, something that might just work, but he had to act fast and smart. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with hope, but also doubt. "There's a loophole," Jake said, his eyes narrowing. "Something they didn't check, something they didn't expect." He sat up straighter, his hands moving with newfound purpose. "I put a conservation easement on the land 2 years ago." He said the words almost in disbelief. "I made sure to protect the land from anything like this. I knew one day someone might try something like this, and now it's our ticket out." Sarah looked at him with a mix of confusion and hope. "Conservation easement? What does that even mean?" "It means they can't develop the land without facing serious consequences," Jake said, his eyes gleaming. "If they violate that easement, they'll be slapped with huge fines and forced to restore everything they've destroyed, and I'll be there to make sure they do." His fingers traced the lines of the map in front of him, his mind working faster than his hands could move. Cheryl and the HOA had no idea what they had just walked into, and Jake was going to make them pay. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The anger that had consumed him moments before began to shift into something else, something dangerous, a sense of purpose that felt like fire coursing through his veins. This wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It was about everything they had taken from him, everything his family had worked for, and he was going to make sure they never got away with it. Jake sat back in his chair, his fingers still tracing the map of the land. The plan was there in his mind, clear and precise. But now came the hard part. He had to execute it without anyone knowing what he was up to. Cheryl Whitmore thought she had. She thought she had taken everything from him, but she was wrong. Jake wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed, not when he had this legal weapon at his disposal. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing on the details of the easement. The terms were airtight. They couldn't touch the land without facing severe consequences. The legal ramifications were clear, and Jake knew how to make them feel it. "Okay," Jake said after a long pause, his voice steady. "I'm going to need to dig into this more, but I've got an idea." Sarah's eyes flickered with cautious optimism. "What are you thinking?" she asked, sitting down beside him, her voice soft but filled with concern. Jake glanced at her, his expression hardening. "I'm going to expose them, every last one of them. I'm going to make sure the public knows exactly what they've done." Her face fell as she processed his words. "How do you even do that?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I'm going to start with the HOA's own bylaws," Jake said, his tone confident but his mind still working out the details. "I'm going to find their violations, their lies, and I'm going to put it all out there for everyone to see." His gaze turned steely as he looked up from the papers and into Sarah's eyes. I'm not going to let them get away with it. They think they can just bulldoze through us like we're nothing, but I'm going to show them that they've picked the wrong family to mess with. Sarah nodded slowly, but Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. She wasn't sure about the plan yet, but she trusted him, and that meant everything. She knew he was capable of fighting back, and now he had a fire in his gut that she hadn't seen before, but this fight was bigger than anything they had faced before. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and late nights spent researching every piece of information he could find on the HOA, its board members, its bylaws, and its finances. Jake scoured the public records looking for any shred of evidence that would help him expose Cheryl and her cronies for what they really were. The deeper he dug, the more he uncovered lies, bribery, and shady deals that went back years. Spent hours combing through the HOA's financial statements and local property records, building a case piece by piece. He could feel his confidence growing as he found more and more cracks in the HOA's armor. He knew they had overstepped their bounds, but finding the evidence to prove it would be the key to taking them down. By the end of the week, Jake had compiled a folder, thick with evidence. It was all there in black and white. The illegal contracts, the false claims, the manipulation of local government officials, and most importantly, the evidence that the HOA had knowingly violated the terms of the conservation easement he had put in place. Jake sat back in his chair and stared at the folder for a moment, a smile creeping onto his face. He had them now. All he needed to do was strike, but he couldn't do it alone. Sarah was his partner in this. He knew she would have his back, but this was bigger than either of them. It was time to bring in the cavalry. Ben, get your phone. Ready, Jake said as he stood up and grabbed his jacket. We're going to need to record everything. Ben, who had been sitting at the kitchen table tapping away on his phone, looked up with a raised eyebrow. Record what, everything? Jake said with a grin. We're going to make sure this goes viral. The next morning, Jake set the plan into motion. He called a meeting with the HOA board under the guise of discussing a possible resolution to the dispute. He'd invited Cheryl and a few key board members to the farm under the pretense of negotiating a settlement. But Jake wasn't interested in negotiating. He wasn't interested in compromise. He was going to make them sweat. When Cheryl and the other board members arrived, Jake greeted them with a warm smile, but inside he was seething. He led them down to the property line where he had set up a camera to capture everything he knew. They would try to bluff their way through the meeting, but he wasn't about to give them the chance. Cheryl smiled politely as she shook Jake's hand, but there was an underlying tension in her eyes. She had no idea what was coming, and Jake was enjoying every second of it. Mr. Thomas, she said, her voice smooth but clipped. I hope we can come to an agreement today and move forward with this issue. Jake chuckled softly. Oh, we will move forward, but not in the way you think, he said as he gestured for them to follow him. If you'll just come with me, I think you'll find this conversation much more enlightening. As they walked toward the edge of the property, Jake felt his pulse quicken. He could already hear the distant hum of the camera's recording, and the sound of his heart beating in his chest. He knew this was the moment everything would change. They reached the line where the land had been marked by the HOA, and Jake stopped, turning to face Cheryl and the others. You see, he said with a grin, I've been doing some digging into your little operation, and I have to say I'm impressed by your ability to play the game. But here's the thing you forgot to account for. He pulled the stack of documents from his jacket and slapped it down onto the wooden table in front of them. The sound of paper hitting wood echoed in the otherwise silent air. I know about the conservation easement, he said, his voice sharp with triumph. Cheryl's face went pale, and for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. What do you mean? She stammered, but Jake could see the panic in her expression. He leaned forward, his smile widening. I've got everything right here. Contracts, communications, financials, and best of all, the fact that your little HOA has been violating the terms of that easement for years, and you've been using your influence to cover it all up. He let the words hang in the air as the silence stretched between them. I think you've underestimated me, Cheryl. The silence was broken only by the sound of the camera clicking on, and Jake knew that the world was about to see exactly who Cheryl Whitmore and her HOA really were. He wasn't done yet, but this was the moment the tide had turned, and he could already feel the power shift in his favor. Cheryl's eyes darted from the pile of documents to Jake's face, her confident facade crumbling under the weight of the evidence in front of her. She took a shaky breath but didn't say a word. The smug arrogance that had once defined her vanished, replaced by something far darker. Jake could feel the shift as if the air itself grew thicker with tension. The silence dragged on like an eternity. He could almost hear her calculating her next move. She had always thought she was untouchable, but now she realized she had stepped into a trap she couldn't escape. "You think you've won, don't you?" Cheryl finally spoke, her voice cold and shaky. "You think a stack of papers and a camera are going to stop me?" Her eyes flicked to the others standing behind her for support, but none of them met her gaze. They knew the game was up. Jake stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't think I've won, Cheryl," he said with a grin. "I know I have." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. He could see her trying to hold it together, but the cracks were showing. The facade was slipping, and he was going to push her until it shattered. "We'll see about that," Cheryl spat as she grabbed for her phone, the fear now clearly evident in her eyes. She dialed quickly, her voice low as she whispered into the phone. But Jake was already a step ahead. He had prepared for this moment. The second he had seen the first signs of her arrogance, he'd been ready to turn the tables before she could make one last desperate call. "Go ahead," Jake said, his voice almost a taunt as he watched Cheryl's hand tremble on the phone. "Call whoever you want. It won't change what's coming." He could see her. Clenching her jaw, she pulled the phone away and shoved it into her pocket, frustration written all over her face. "This isn't over," Cheryl said with a venomous look. She turned her back to him and began to march toward the road where her car was parked, her heels clicking sharply against the gravel. The other board members followed her, but none of them spoke a word. They knew their time was up. Jake watched them go, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. But it wasn't enough yet. This was only the beginning. He knew they would try to cover this up somehow. They would try to bury the truth, but Jake wasn't going to let that happen. He had been too close to losing everything to let them walk away unscathed. "Let's make sure they don't forget this," Jake muttered to Ben, who had been recording the entire exchange. Ben nodded in agreement, his fingers already flying over his phone as he typed something out quickly. "It's all going up online," he said with a grin. "Let's give the world a front row seat to their downfall." The plan was simple. They were going to leak the evidence to every news outlet they could reach and make sure it went viral. Jake wasn't just fighting for his farm anymore. He was fighting for anyone who had ever been stepped on by corrupt people like Cheryl Whitmore and her HOA cronies. He had no intention of letting them escape unscathed, and with the evidence in hand, he could already feel the world beginning to shift as Jake and Ben worked to get the story out there. Sarah stayed back at the farm, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she also knew her husband was right. Jake had always been the kind of man to stand up and fight, but this was different. This was a battle that could change everything for them. By the time the evening news aired, Jake's plan had already begun to take hold. The first headlines were already flashing across the screen. Corruption exposed in local HOA. Family farm seized under false pretenses, and real estate scams plagued the community. The words were out there now, and they were only going to grow louder with every passing hour. The more people learned about Cheryl's illegal actions, the more they would demand answers, the more pressure she would feel. Jake sat back in his chair watching the news unfold, his heart pounding in his chest as the story spread. He knew it was just a matter of time before Cheryl and her cronies would try to spin the story in their favor, but it didn't matter. The truth was already out there, and it was too late for them to stop it now. The phone rang, breaking the silence in the room. Jake's eyes narrowed as he reached for it. "Hello," he said, his voice calm but alert. "Mr. Thomas." The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but Jake recognized the authority in it. "This is Officer Reynolds from the Sheriff's Department. We've received a tip about some questionable activities involving Cheryl Whitmore and her HOA. I need you to meet with us immediately." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "You've seen the evidence," he said, his voice tight with anticipation. "We have," Reynolds replied, "and we're taking it very seriously, but we need your help. To make sure we can move forward with the investigation, I need you to come down to the station and give us a statement." Jake's mind raced. He couldn't believe it. They were finally going to take action. The justice he had fought for was within his reach now. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about making sure no one else had to suffer under the tyranny of corrupt people like Cheryl Whitmore and her HOA. "I'll be there," Jake said firmly. "I'll bring everything you need." He hung up the phone and turned to Sarah, a sense of relief washing over him. "It's happening," he said, his voice low but filled with triumph. "They're going to pay for what they've done." Sarah's eyes met his, and for the first time in days she saw the man she had always known, the man who fought for what was right. No matter the cost, she stepped forward and put her hand on his shoulder. "We're going to get through this," she said softly. "We're going to make sure they never hurt anyone again." Jake nodded, a smile spreading across his face. He was ready to finish what he had started. He wasn't just taking down an HOA. He was taking down an entire system that thought it could control people like him. But they were wrong. They had underestimated him, and now they were about to pay the price.